started with this week's brief introduction by video. Last week we looked at the topic of cultural relativism, and we started with a paper by James Rachels which was called Moral Relativism, and it was in his book called The Elements of Moral Philosophy. So Rachel sets out to provide a more detailed analysis of cultural relativism, and he starts by sort of listing 5 precepts of what he sees of moral relativism. And he tries to show that some of those principles conflict with each other, and when you follow them out, they can create problems for the theory. So through exploring these different cultural relativism precepts, he thinks that even as you go through them, you find that there are certain universals that have to hold in the case of relativism. And some of those universals he lists are the right to life, the obligation to keep promises, things like that, because essentially he argues that even in cultural relativism, what it is morality is a system designed to help society function more efficiently, which is a type of contractualism which Harman also talks about in his paper, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But essentially, Rachels comes up with the type of utilitarian principle, and his sort of principle he thinks that we should look at when we're judging whether, or a culture or society should look at when they're judging whether something should be morally accepted or not, is does that practice benefit society as a whole? And also there's a corollary to that that says if the practice doesn't benefit society as a whole, is there a better option? So he thinks if you ask those 2 questions, you can get at a type of morality that benefits society in the best way, and it also contains certain universals of the fact that people, have to follow through on their promises, and people don't have to be afraid of being murdered and things like that. There are a couple of issues that came up in our discussion when we were talking about that. The first question is, who is it that's actually deciding what is beneficial for society? For example, in the instance he gives of the excision, or the female circumcision, as it's sometimes called in Africa, he provides an argument for that it can benefit society in a certain way, but the question becomes, who is it that's really making that argument? Is it the women who are actually going through the process, or is it the people, probably the men who are in power that are making that argument? And are the women's rights really being violated by that process? And it seems like a bit of a fraught thing to say, and it's true with any form of utilitarianism, in my opinion. How do you decide what has the most utility? I mean, and going back to what I was talking about last week about Hare in his book, he talks about how challenging it is to know all the factors that it takes to determine whether something truly benefits society or not. So it can be a very difficult principle to apply. Another interesting suggestion somebody brought up, I thought, was how do you determine where a culture stops and starts? When you have certain boundaries, if you have a culture or a country that's adjacent to another's, do they share the same culture or not? Do they share the same cultural practices? And sort of how do you delineate between those different cultures? So I think that can be an interesting question, especially as our world becomes more and more connected. So that was Rachel's. The next paper we looked at, and the exercise that I had you guys do, was to reconstruct Harman's argument in Moral Relativism Defended. And I thought you guys did a really good job with that. I know that's not an easy task to go through and do it, but I think it's a very useful exercise. And if you decide that you want to continue on in philosophy, that's something that you're probably going to be doing with most of the papers that you read. Maybe not actually writing it out, but going through the process of that sort of thought process is really beneficial. So in the paper, Harman essentially argues that morality is a type of, he calls it an implicit agreement that takes place in a culture, and I refer to that as a type of contractualism. And it's the theory goes back quite a ways. It's a social contract theory. In the paper, he talks about how his thesis is more along the lines of Aristotle and Hobbes, Hobbes is believed that obviously the theory of the Leviathan is that it's in the best interest of the individuals to come to some sort of agreement so they don't have to constantly live in fear and society can progress and things like that. So he's working with a type of contractual argument in that way. So that's his first conclusion, is that morality is a type of agreement that's agreed upon within people in a certain society. And the second conclusion that he reaches, which leads him to his relativism, is that that type of morality is relative to the society in which that contract is formed. And that's because the motivational attitudes that one has to accept to participate in that contract vary from culture to culture. So some problems with this theory. First of all, I think Harman's going to disagree with this a bit, but personally I think that any type of contractualism tends to rely upon a principle of fairness, or a principle of promise keeping. You have this agreement, but in order for the agreement to work, you have to assume that people are going to keep that promise, and that's a type of universal principle that says that one ought to, in his language, keep a promise. He says that that's a type of misunderstanding, and that in the very phrase agreement, that's assumed that when someone agrees with it, they intend to keep that promise. But in my opinion, that's he's begging the question there a bit. So that's one potential problem with it. Another interesting question people discuss quite a bit in the sort of the discussion forum was the point that, and this is a selling point that Harman uses for his argument, that the negative rights are more important, or tend to be adhered to more in society than the positive rights. And by that I mean where he's talking about people tend to follow the idea that it's better to not do harm than it is to help someone else. And the reasoning that Harman gives for that is, he says that because it is a social contract agreement, if the duty to help were stronger than the duty not to do harm, then the agreement wouldn't go through, because the wealthiest people, or the people that are the most able to in society, would be sort of saddled with too big of a burden that they wouldn't agree to. So the agreement wouldn't work, and he thinks because of that he can sort of answer why the idea of negative duties or negative rights seems to hold more weight than the idea that you need to help somebody out. Of course that's one explanation for that, but there are many different explanations for why negative rights are more important than positive rights, and we saw that a bit in the case study. And the simple thing is, I think it's much easier to know that you shouldn't murder somebody than to say that you need to extend a certain type of privilege to someone else. We don't necessarily know what is good for somebody else. There are many controversial points and many disputes